I'm honored. I am honored to be here with you tonight because I've just learned, as more and more I've learned about your church and what you do here, talking with your pastor, talking with your elders, the more impressed I've become, especially with what you're doing here on Wednesday nights and equipping the youth and the curriculum that you use here. Very impressive. So I'm honored to be asked to be addressing you this year for AppCon. So I understand, from what I understand, this is a church that likes to think. You're down to earth, but you like to think. And so I'm going to begin with a brain teaser, okay, just to get us thinking tonight, right? So here's the brain teaser. You have two kids, two children, a boy and girl, sitting on a park bench. One of them has blonde hair, the other has brown hair. The child with the blonde hair says, "I'm a girl." The child with the brown hair says, "I'm a boy." We also know at least one of them is lying. So here's the question. Which is the boy and which is the girl by hair color? Okay? Two children, a boy and a girl sitting on a park bench. One of them says, "I'm a boy." One with the blonde hair says, child with the blonde hair says, "I'm a girl." Child with the brown hair says, "I'm a boy." At least one of them is lying. Can you tell me which one is the boy and which one is the girl? Anybody? Yeah, that's why we call it a brain teaser, right? Had to think it through. I think some people have got it. Anybody? Okay, Mark says that the boy is blonde. And why would you say that? You're there. You're pretty much there. Yeah. Well, the answer is, Mark is right, the boy is blonde, and the girl, no, I'm sorry, it's the other way around. Yes, the child with the blonde hair is a boy, and the child with the brown hair is a girl. How do we know that? Because, yeah?
If both of them can still make a false statement. So if you have one false statement and the other option, basically they're both making false statements.
Very good. What he said in kind of plainer English is, if one of them is lying, then both of them have to be lying. Because one says, "I'm a boy," then he must be a girl. If the other one lying is a girl and is really a girl, it has to be a boy, right? So the answer is, if one of them is lying, both of them is lying. And so we can know which one is the boy and which one is the girl. Okay, that's what gender is like. And it's really cute, like this little couple here. You can't have one without the other, because God's gift of gender is about relationship. And gender is also like this brain teaser, in that at first you look at it and you say, I don't know if there's an answer to that question about the park bench. Right? You think, wow, this is just, I don't know how to say this. I don't think there's an answer. And later you find out that there is an answer, actually. So what you might have thought that there wasn't an answer to on this gender question, it turns out there was an answer. And so in the same way, there are answers to the gender questions you may think have no answer for us. There are answers today. And we're going to get to them over the course of this weekend, whatever they are. But before we start, I want to tell you why I'm standing here tonight, why I'm on the platform talking to you. And I'm going to do it by giving you a few stories, 3 stories from earlier in my ministry, earlier in my pastoral ministry. Okay, and we're going to start with a really hard question. This comes from the time when I was a candidate, what we call a candidate for, make sure I got that. Yeah. For a pastoral position in a church. I don't know how many of you have ever been a part of a search process for a church. When a church is looking for a pastor, I know you've had a pretty smooth transition recently to your new pastor, but very often it's a very involved search, right? If a church needs a pastor, they go through all these different candidates. Maybe they narrow them down. You have a search committee, right? And if you've ever been part of this, maybe you interview him, you invite him to come and preach at your church, and then maybe there's a Q&A. You talk to him, see how he meshes with the church or not. And I was part of this process once as a candidate myself. And it was going pretty well. I had been invited to the church to come and preach. I preached a sermon. It went pretty well. Afterwards, there was a Q&A. And most of the Q&A was really kind of fun. It was real softball questions like, what's your favorite football team? And, what do you say to your kids at night? Stuff like that. And then in the middle of this Q&A, a young woman stands up in the middle of the room, several hundred people, and she says this, when I come to this church, I notice we sing this song, Just As I Am. How many of you know that song? Just As I Am, right? We know that just as I am, without one plea, except the blood Jesus shed for me. She said, well, we sing this song when I come to this church. Well, I'm a lesbian. And I want to know, if you're going to be the pastor of this church, will I be welcome here just as I am? Okay, it wasn't fun anymore, this Q&A, right? Okay, you could hear a pin drop as this room of several hundred people were wondering, say, what will this potential pastor say? How is he going to answer this question? And friends, as I was standing there with this young woman asking this question, I realized something, that this is not a yes or no question. If she would be welcome in my church. And so what I realized when I was confronting this question is that she needed something, and the congregation needed something to be able to answer this question. Not just a yes or no. What she needed and what I would need to provide for her is a theology of gender, okay? A reasoning of why I would answer the way that I would, right? That's the first story. We'll come back to that, actually, a little later. Second story, not too long distant from this time, I was in my office and I had a visit from a member of the congregation. We'll call him Mark, not his real name. But Mark was a kind of important person in our congregation, and he was coming to talk to me. And we had a good rapport. We had certain things that had happened and had gone well, and I had a good rapport with him as a pastor. But this was a difficult conversation. And he was being very brave in coming and speaking to me. And the conversation did not go well. Because Mark sat down and he started to tell me that the friend that he had been attending church with for the last several months wasn't actually a friend. It was his partner. And he had been with this partner living together in what I call a monogendered relationship, a same-sex relationship, for about 1.5 years now. And he went into his whole history with me, talked about how when he was in 6th grade, he knew that he was different. He walked in, sat down with his mother at the kitchen table and said, Mom, I'm gay, and I know I'm gay. And how as later on he became a Christian and he tried so many different ways to deal with this, tried to pray and tried to do these different things, but he said he'd finally come to the point where he was going to stop lying to God and to be honest about who he really was. And that's what he was doing now. And he said he had a great relationship with this other man that he was living with, and they would have Bible studies together. And this is the way he was, and he said, I was born this way. I will never be different. And so I took out my Bible and I opened it. I went to different verses. I said, these are the verses that help us understand this is not God's way for us as followers of Jesus Christ. And I remember, folks, I remember the pleading in his eyes as he looked at me sitting there in my office. And he said to me, Sam, can you meet me halfway? can you tell me why God would say such a thing? And I realized, friends, that what he needed at that moment, and what I was struggling, I didn't have for him, was simply this: a theology of gender. Okay? More to come on that story, I'll tell you later. Third story. Also around this time, I was going through a New Testament book in the Bible when we were, in the pulpit. We were preaching through books, and we came to a passage that was kind of difficult, that distinguished men and women in what they did in the church. And it's one of these New Testament passages that's kind of controversial sometimes. And I took a look at this and said, I'm not going to skip over this. I'm going to be faithful to the whole Bible book. I'm going to take this passage as well. So, friends, I studied, and I wrote for a long time, took a long time with this, and I made all of these illustrations that were going to illustrate this point, and I ran it past my wife to make sure it was sensitive to women's concerns. And let me just tell you, I wrote a really good sermon. I just want you to know, first of all, it was a really good sermon, okay? I did all of these things, and I said, I'm going to preach the best sermon on this passage ever. And so I did. I went and I preached the sermon. This is me preaching the sermon. Actually, it's not me. It's John Knox. But this is how I imagined myself preaching the sermon. You see these academics, and they're like huffy, and the noblemen are saying, what's he saying there? And the clergy are like all offended, and women are fainting. And this is what it was like, this sermon, because it really was a great sermon. Finished the sermon, and actually right after the sermon, right down in front, this gal came. She was this woman in our church. She was the head of the children's ministry. She was a great gal, and she was very thoughtful. And right after the sermon finished, she was right down here in front of the pulpit, front and center. And so I stepped down to talk to her, and I said, this is great. She's going to tell me, how great this sermon was, right? First words out of her mouth. First words. This doesn't help me. And I said, well, yeah, but it was still a really great sermon, right? It's like she said, this doesn't help me. She said, even if I go with you and go along with this idea that there are certain things maybe I should not be doing in church where men should be, even if I do accept that, she said, it doesn't move me an inch toward knowing what I should be doing in the church. Doesn't help me as a woman to understand how I glorify God specifically as a woman. And I said to her, you are absolutely right. Because, friends, again, there was a moment where I realized that she needed something that I and the church wasn't giving her. And guess what that was? You tell me. Theology of gender, exactly. So because of these experiences, and there are others, many like these, that is why I'm on the platform here talking to you. It's not because I'm such a great pastor. There are many pastors, actually, I know, that are better pastors than I am. But from the beginning of the ministry that I was doing, I began to get these experiences where I realized if I was going to be halfway useful to the Lord, I needed to address this. I needed to understand. And I needed to have a theology of gender for people. So that's what this is going to be about. What I recognized is that all kinds of questions that people have today, all kinds of questions you hear people asking, or maybe you're asking, what makes a true woman? What's a real man? Is gender even something that's real? Does it matter in relationships? Or is the gender binary a means of oppression? What does God think of it? So many questions that people struggle with today. I'm just going to put some questions up here for you. Because these are the kinds of questions that we hear. So many questions that people struggle with today. Does the Bible tell me to submit to my husband in decision making, even if I'm a better decision maker? How come as a man I feel emasculated in this culture? Why would God deny true love to my same-sex attracted friend? In the Old Testament, are men superior to women? Should our church have a woman pastor? How should I respond to my DEI department directives at work? If I have a boy body and I feel like a girl, should I transition? One question really underlies all these different questions. And that question is, what is gender? What is it? What does it mean? Why do we have it? And so what we're going to do this weekend is I'm going to give you what you need so that you don't feel as helpless as you face your particular gender conundrum, whichever of these questions is on your mind. So you don't feel hopeless when you face your difficult gender issue, or when someone in a lab coat tells you that your child is going to commit suicide. And so what I want us all to do, and this is my hope and my prayer, is to move from maybe discomfort or even dread at some of the things God commands to celebration of what God has created. And as man and woman are kind of disintegrating around us, to realize intimacy and fruitfulness in our relationships because they are revealing God's very self through the gift of gender. How are we going to do that? We're going to do that by 7 principles, as Nate was saying. And what we're going to do is just go through them, and we're going to derive them, and we're going to see where they are in the scriptures. And we're going to say, what does the Bible tell us about gender? If we could just say, these are the principles that God gives us about gender. That's what I'm going to try to build with you this weekend. Please write down your questions, and we're going to have various times. It looks like we might not have time tonight, but we're going to have various times throughout the weekend for you to be asking your questions. And we want to hear them because you will have questions as we go through this. It's a big topic, and we want to address them and try to see how these things are applied in our lives. Okay? And the way we're going to do this is by going through these questions. We're going to start with the first principle. But to introduce each of these principles, we have a little bit of a game that we're going to do. It's kind of fun. And I think it'll be great for you because I know this is a church that reads its Bible. Okay? We have some copies of one of the books called Engendered, which goes through these principles. Not quite the presentation I'm giving here, but a presentation of these different principles. And I'm going to give this away. So we're going to give a free book away each time we do a principle. But you don't know me very well. I'll just tell you, I don't do things for nothing. Okay? I always kind of do something for giving something away. And so what I want to do is ask you a Bible question. All right? And I want you to raise your hand. So please don't call out the answer. All right? If you think you know the answer, I want you to raise your hand. And I will try to, please give me some grace. I'll try to see which hands go up and choose them in the right order. Okay? And the first person to give me a right answer, has to be a right answer, wins the book. Okay? So we're going to have some fun. All right. First question. Okay. In the New Testament, this isn't a hard question. In the New Testament, Jesus Christ is compared to a member of the marriage covenant. Okay? And here's the question. In the New Testament, is Christ compared to the husband in a marriage relationship or to the wife in a marriage relationship? In the New Testament, is Christ compared to a husband in the New Testament or to a wife? Or a husband or bridegroom in the New Testament or to a wife or bride in the New Testament? I see first hand here. The answer, sir? says the wife. You know, that's a very good answer, but it's not actually the correct answer. I think I saw a hand here, did I? Okay, I just took the answer down. Yes, is there another answer? Both is the answer. We have a winner. Could we have a hand for this guy? Well done. The answer is both. So, yes, sir, it's right that Christ is compared to the wife in the 1 Corinthians 11 passage, but you go over to Ephesians 5 and you find that Christ is compared to the husband or bridegroom. The answer is both. And that's a good kind of way to introduce what we're going to be talking about tonight when it comes to gender and how we understand gender. Very important. Okay, so we're going to begin with our first principle. Very well done. All right. There we go. We're going through these slides. We have different slides. All right. All right. If you start talking about gender from the Bible, and anybody who does this always ends up in the same place. If you're going to say, what does the Bible teach us about gender? What are we to understand from that? Everybody who does this has to end up eventually with the same place. And that place is Moses, right? In the beginning of the Bible, Genesis 1 and 2, because that's where it starts. And that's where gender is really talked about. Well, it's where gender is created in the beginning, right? So anybody who talks about this has to always go to Moses and what he says about it, okay? This is representation of Moses. The problem is, folks, that Moses gives us a narrative about the creation of gender and different things about gender, but it's hard to tell what's important in the story that he gives us about it, right? You know the story, you've read it. And it's hard to understand what exactly the point is that he's trying to make, right? And this is what people debate endlessly, okay? What is important about the creation of Eve, for example? Is that it was taken from his rib? Is it that it was after the animals? What's the important fact of the narrative? Okay, so it could be this sentence, it could be that sentence. Sometimes it's this or that word. What word is important in the passage? How do we know that? Well, you know, it's always great when someone in the Bible reads another part of the Bible for us. Okay? We call that sometimes intertextuality. And when we have someone else in the Bible reading another part of the Bible, it's always great because that person helps us to understand what was meant, right? Well, in this case, we just happen to have such a person, and his name is the Apostle Paul. Okay? And the Apostle Paul, in his writings, relates gender to the creation narrative at least 10 times. And that's just in the writings that we do have from Paul. There are letters of the Apostle Paul we don't have, but in the letters that even we do have, he relates gender to the creation narrative, what Moses wrote, about 10 times or more than that. And so he's thought a lot about gender and human origins. Okay? So it's wonderful that we have his interpretation of what Moses wrote, because that helps us understand what's important in what Moses wrote. Does it make sense? Okay? And so what we're going to do tonight is we're going to look at his kind of quintessential reading of Genesis 1 and 2, which he does in one place. He writes about it in different places in part, but he takes it on sort of and lays out his theology of what's going on in Genesis 1 and 2 in terms of gender in the famous head covering passage in 1 Corinthians 11. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take that passage. I'm going to ask you to open to it if you have your Bibles here. I'm going to ask somebody to read it for us in a moment. Because this is a place where Paul really looks back and says, this is what it means. This is what's important in the passage. And we're going to use that all weekend and interpret it and try to understand it to come up with our theology of gender. Okay, so maybe we do have a microphone here. So maybe Nate can bring that to somebody, or Nate, if you have it, maybe you could read it. I'd like you to read 1 Corinthians 11, and let's read verses 2 through 12 for time here. We'll say 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 12. Do you have it there?
I do.
Okay. And
Is
what
that
version?
NIV okay?
What's that?
NIV okay?
Yeah, all right. Sure, go ahead.
I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding to the teachings just as I passed them on to you. Now I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head, and every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is just as though her head were shaved. If a woman does not cover her head, she should have her hair cut off. And if it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut or shaved off, she should cover her head. A man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. For this reason, and because of the angels, the woman ought to have a sign of authority on her head. In the Lord, however, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman.
Okay. Very good. Thank you. So there we have it. Did I get switched off here? Okay. So there's a lot in that passage, isn't it? A lot of questions that might come up in your mind. But we're gonna go for our first principle tonight, and our first principle is going to be this: gender is a gift of being made in the image of God, in the image of the Triune God. And I shortened it a little bit on the screen, but gender is a gift of being made in the image of God. Okay. How do we understand that? Well, let's go back to that passage, and I want to start maybe toward the end of the passage. In verses 11 through 12, if you would look at that with me. In the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman, and all things are from God. And what I want to do is pay attention to the prepositions in that, because they tell us something very important. What he says is, woman was made from a man. And that, underneath that "from" in the Greek is this Greek preposition ek, which means out of. And that's appropriate, right? If you think back to the story, now this is again Paul reading Genesis 2, and you remember the story that God did this operation. He put Adam into this deep rest. He opened up his side, took out a rib. He formed the woman, right? So she came out of him. And that's really what ek means. Kind of literally, ek means out of. And Paul goes on, he says, as woman was made and came out of man, okay, so man is now born of woman. So literally, again, every man that lives today came out of a woman. That's man comes out of, right? Same preposition, same idea. Not the same preposition, because he just kind of condenses it. But it's the same idea. And then, last statement, all things are from God, and it's the same preposition, ek. So, panta ek tu theou. All things come out of God. Well, what are the all things? It's the things that he's been talking about. Man, woman, masculinity, femininity. These things come out of God, is what he's saying. And it kind of goes along with the whole story. As woman was taken out of man, as man comes out of woman. So all of these things are somehow coming out of God. These things being masculinity, femininity, the creation of gender, comes out of God. Okay, so what does that mean? Does that mean that God is gendered? Well, we wouldn't say that. because the scriptures tell us that God dwells in unapproachable light. His greatness is unsearchable. God is so far beyond us, we can't even understand him. That's what the scriptures mean when Job says, the Almighty is beyond our reach. Okay, it says this in different ways. But God created us so that we would know him. And so God created something in us so that we could look at it as an analogy and say, this tells us something true about God. And that is that thing in us we call gender. It's something we could call ectypal theology. That is, we are the ectype, God is the archetype. That somehow there's something in God, and when it comes out in us, when he makes us, it comes out as gender, as our human experience. That's what's being said here. So you want to know where gender comes from? It comes from God, out of God. Okay? Well, where is Paul getting that? How does Paul know that? Well, he's getting this from his reading of Genesis, from his reading of Moses. And so if we go back there, what do we read that Paul was reading? So God created man in his own image. You know that verse, right? Genesis 1:27. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created him. Okay, there it is, the imago Dei, the image of God. God created man in his image. What does that mean? Have you ever wondered that? Have you ever sat down and said, yeah, I hear that, I see that, but what does it actually mean to be in the image of God? Well, if you've ever sat and wondered that, you're not alone. Actually, many people have thought about what the image of God means, and they've written volumes about this down through church history. And what I'm going to do very quickly is summarize for you what they've said. I'm going to summarize for you. It's basically the meaning, the answer falls into one of three categories of answers. I'm going to paint with broad brushstrokes here. But basically, if you say, what does it mean to be in the image of God? People who have read this text, people who have thought about it deeply, very smart people, have come up with three answers to this. Okay? First answer, what it means to be in the image of God, is to say that we share God's attributes. This was very popular in the early church, the church fathers. They said what it means to be in the image of God is that just as God has mercy, like he's merciful, so we are merciful too. You know, and just as God is love, like we have some love. Just as God is all-knowing, you know, we know some things. God has a will, so kind of we have a will. Okay, and you can kind of discuss and puzzle out. Some of these are more communicable than others. But basically, that's what we are. We're sharing in the attributes of God. And you know, if you think about it, yeah, that kind of makes some sense, right? There's probably some truth to that. That's the first answer. But as people looked at the text, and they went back to the text and said, you know, that's to say, well, what it means to be in the image of God is that we share the attributes of God. That's kind of a Greek way of thinking. You know, the Greeks kind of think that way, putting everything in categories and organizing it that way. And that's probably not the way the original audience took these words when it was first written. That's probably not what they were thinking. And so they go back and they say, if you look at the passage in which this appears, you see that God said, let us make man in our image. And then he says, let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and the bird of the air. And so the second idea is that we are in the image of God because we express God's dominion over the earth, right? And we could call this the biblical theological answer to the imago Dei, to the image of God. Because as archaeologists have gone and studied in the ancient Near East, what they find is that emperors or kings, whenever people had dominion over an area, they would make these statues. And you find these all over the ancient Near East. They would make these images, and they would set them up all over their empire, all over their land. And they're all over the place. You do archaeology. You find these images, these statues, and the ruler would multiply these geographically and numerically. And they were there so that you would walk by, and it was as if, you know, the statue was saying to you, look on me, Ozymandias, ye mighty, and my works, and despair. It was like you would know who was in charge because you would look at this image and you would say, I can tell who's in charge in this land. And so what God was doing when he made us in his image and he said, and he multiplied us over all the earth, is he was showing that Yahweh was in charge of the whole earth. Because Yahweh had dominion. And as we exercise dominion, it shows that God has dominion over the earth, which means, folks, that we're basically statues. Okay? I mean, upgraded, of course, but we're upgraded statues that show God is in charge of all the earth. Now, if you think about it, and you think about the passage, that does make sense, does it not? Probably also some truth to that. That's a second answer. But then there were others who said, if you go back to the actual verse, when God does his creating, he says, let us make man in our image. Then he creates man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created him. And if you look at what the verse actually says about being made in God's image, it says that we are made with gender. We are made male and female. We are made in a way that helps us enter into relationship with our own gender and then across the genders in an intergendered way. And that somehow captures the image of God. And this starts to take on new meaning, especially in light of the New Testament revelation, that God is not just a unity, but God is also a plurality. God is not just one, but he is three in one. He is Trinity as well as unity. And then this starts to take on even new meaning for us. So in light of the New Testament revelation, this starts to make a lot of sense, that at least part of what it means to be in the image of God is that we are made to be in relationship. We are made gendered to be in relationship. And doesn't it sound like that in the verse when God speaks and he says, let us make man in our image? Okay, and some people look at that and say, oh, that's just the royal we. Except that God doesn't talk that way. This is very rare. This is very uncommon for God to express himself this way. In fact, it only does it 3 times in the Old Testament. Only 3 times, all kind of, when it happens, always has to do, interestingly, with relationship. And the 3 times that he uses this expression. So this is not a common way for God to express himself, but he does say it here. Let us make man in our image. The only reference nearby in that chapter are the Word and the Spirit. So friends, what this would mean is that to be in the image of God, at least in part, as I say, is to be made gendered, to be made in relationship. And that comes out of God. Now, if this is the case, if in fact that image consists in being made gendered, being made male and female, I'll tell you, that would make certain features of what happens next in the narrative make a lot more sense. What do I mean? Well, if we go on to Genesis chapter 2, God tells the story. It's where the narrator then stops, steps closer and says, let's go over day 6, creation day 6, more closely. And he talks about the creation of Adam and the creation of Eve. And you remember the story. God said, it's not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him. And so he causes a deep sleep to fall upon the man. And while he slept, he took one of his ribs, closed up the place with flesh. The rib that the Lord God had taken, he made into the woman, brought her to the man. The man said, this at last is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. She'll be called woman. She was taken out of man. You remember the story. Okay, here's the question. Why did God do it this way? Why did God decide to create in this manner? Because, he's God. He could do it however he wanted. And what he could have done is he could have made the guy first and then had the woman spring whole cloth out of the guy's head, okay, like Athena does from Zeus. Didn't do it that way. Or he could have made the woman first and then looked at her, kind of cocked his head, said, I think I can do a better job, and then make the man. Okay? So said Aristotle. That's what he thought happened, not the Bible. Or he could have made 14 chunks of clay, divided them in half, and had 7 become female and 7 become male, as Mammy does in the Babylonian flood story. Could have done it that way. Doesn't do it that way. No, he does it this way. Why? Why did he do it this way? Now, if you listen to people like me, preachers and rabbis, you might get the impression that he did it this way just to provide fodder for wedding sermons. Okay? Just because we have to say something nice and beautiful at a wedding, right? So we do this midrash on this text and we say, oh, well, he didn't take it, from the head, or then, she would dominate him. And he didn't take it from the foot, or he would step on her. But instead he took it from the side. And doesn't the bride look beautiful in that dress? And isn't this beautiful? So they could be partners. Okay, that kind of thing. But God doesn't do things so that we have fodder for wedding sermons. He doesn't do things in an arbitrary way. Especially something like this, kind of a brutal operation that he does. He doesn't do that for arbitrary reasons. Why? Well, let me introduce you to Gregory of Nazianzus and the Council of Constantinople in 381. Those of you who know your church history know that this was a crucial church council, because this is where the church came to understand how to talk about God, specifically about the divine persons in the Trinity. And Gregory was a big, big factor in how that came about. All through the 4th century, Gregory and 2 other partners of his were instrumental for the church coming to understand how we should talk about the members of the Trinity, specifically the first 2 members of the Trinity. And in 381, in the Council of Nicaea earlier in the century, they decided it, but there was still controversy all through the century, and then it was settled in 381, the Council of Constantinople, and it was settled with this word, homoousios. Some of you might remember that word, and if you know that word, you get the point. Homoousios means of the same substance, and it was at the Council of Constantinople that it was settled that the second member of the Trinity was of the same substance as the first member. Of the first. Equal because he was of the same substance. That was crucial. And the third as well. So what's interesting is that Gregory of Nazianzus, in that same year, 381, he preached a sermon in which he referenced this passage about Adam and Eve. And this is what he said was the point. He said that Eve was homoousios of Adam. Eve was of the same substance of Adam. That was the point. That was why God created the way that the way that he created her. He took of Adam's substance so she would be of the same substance, just as the second member of the Trinity is of the same substance as the first member of the Trinity. So what we're seeing here is the image. That we have gender because it's speaking something about the relationship within the Trinity itself. And I think Adam agrees with this, with Gregory of Nazianzus, sort of anachronistically. I think of it because look at what Adam says when they come together. When Eve finally is brought to him, what does he say? He exhumes this interjection. He says, "At last, bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh," right? Of the same substance. So this is Adam telling us this is the point of the story. Because she was taken out of men. There's that out of again. Now you see where Paul was getting his teaching from. And so what follows in the narrative is God saying these two, one of the other, of the same substance, then come together and multiply to make a third. Okay? That's what happens in the narrative. So what we have here is Eve coming out of the same substance of equal to Adam and yet distinct. And they become one, and from their union proceeds a third. What does that remind you of? So this is what Paul is reading as he gives us his deep understanding of gender. You see, when God splayed out his image in space and time, okay, this is not, we don't say these are these things, one, God is man and woman, but what we say is when he had something that when he splayed out his image in space and time, what it came out for us as is gender in our world. Friends, you have got to get a hold of this if you are going to be able to address our generation and the generation to come. But when you get a hold of this, it changes the way that you understand male and female. It changes the way you understand man and woman. When you see how deep this goes, it creates something beautiful. You know, I had some friends whose daughter went off to college, and she came home. She was an artist. She came home and she decided that she was queer non-binary. And so she told her parents, I'm queer non-binary now. And it was a tragic, tragic thing because she was like, she had an experience that was not great with a guy, and she just did not like what that meant, and she decided she wasn't going to do that anymore. She was just queer non-binary. And, lovely girl, her parents were heartbroken. And I talked to him. I said, why don't you talk to her about what gender means in the Bible? And so he did. He sat her down and said, could we just talk for a few minutes about where gender comes from and what it means? And he did. He sat down and he talked with her about these things. Later on, the father and mother were in the kitchen, and they overheard a phone conversation between this girl and her queer non-binary friend, that they were having this conversation. And apparently, they were talking about different things, and she said to the guy on the other end of the phone, yeah, my dad sat me down, and he talked about gender from the Bible. And her friend apparently on the phone said, oh, I'm so sorry. That must have been really difficult for you to sit through. I'm really sad you had to go through that. And she said, no, you don't understand. He almost had me convinced that gender was something real. He almost had me convinced that gender was something real, something beautiful. Friends, that's the effect that we can have if we understand this teaching of what it means to be in God's image. It takes the emphasis off these other things that were really bothering her, guys gawking and these kinds of things. And it puts back the dignity in what it means to be a woman, in what it means to be a man. God made us this way so that we could know him, and he made us gendered so that we could share something of his delight that he has within himself. All right, very good. Well, I think what I would like to do is take a brief break here. You've been very patient. You've been very attentive. I appreciate that. I don't like you to have to sit too long. So I think what we'll try to do is 4-minute breaks. I'm going to invite you to get up and be back in 4 minutes, and we're going to continue with the rest of with the next principle. Okay? See you in 4.